Am I a Peter or a Paul? We're most familiar with Peter because he walked with Jesus as a disciple, then served Jesus as an apostle and a bondservant. This is how he addressed himself. We know that he lived in Capernaum with his brother Andrew. He was a fisherman by trade. They owned their own business. They were not poor as is often portrayed. They would have been middle class, not rich. We know that Peter was married and that one of the Marks in the Bible is his son. Many believe the Gospel of Mark was written by Peter's son. We know of his failure at the trial of Jesus when Peter denied knowing Jesus 3 times. We know of his success on the day of Pentecost. His first sermon led to 3,000 people getting saved. He led the church in Jerusalem and Judea for the first few years where the church got stuck. It was the martyrdom of the deacon Stephen that led the church to spread out as persecution arose, and this is when we're first introduced to Paul, who was known as Saul. So the church began to spread out into Samaria, and then they got stuck again. So God gave Peter a vision of animals being let down from heaven on a sheet and told him to kill and eat. But Peter said, "Not so, Lord, for I have never eaten anything common or unclean." And God told Peter, "What God has cleansed or declared clean, you must not call common." This happened 3 times, and then God told Peter to go with the men who were knocking at the gate, and this led to the Gentiles hearing and receiving the gospel message. And so began the expansion of the church into the greater world. Peter wrote 2 of the epistles, and though it's not in the Bible, we know he went to Rome and was crucified upside down. We are also familiar with Paul because of his great conversion experience and his many evangelistic travels. He called himself a bondservant and an apostle, and once a prisoner of Christ. To the Thessalonians, he just called himself Paul. He was from Tarsus of Cilicia, a Jewish Roman citizen, brought up in Jerusalem under Gamaliel as a zealot Pharisee, but he was not a member of the Sanhedrin. He would have been familiar with Jesus and his teachings, which is why he said, "I persecuted this way to the death." He was not married, as some teach. In 1 Corinthians, they say that because to be in the Sanhedrin, you had to be married. And so they assume that he was married. But the scriptures never says he was in the Sanhedrin. And when he brags about his own qualifications as a Hebrew, he never says he was a member of the Sanhedrin, because he would have included that. So, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, teaching about marriage, he says, "But I say this as a concession, not as a commandment. For I wish that all men were even as myself. But each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. But I say to the unmarried and the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am." So he was single. He was single his whole life. Paul made 3 known and described missionary trips. We find those in the book of Acts, chapters 11, verses 19 to 30, and 12, verses 25 through 28:31. He was making disciples and raising up local leaders. He traveled with several different people over the years and raised up many first-century church leaders. He wrote 14 of the epistles, but like Peter, some of Paul's life is not in the Bible. We know that he was beheaded in Rome during his 2nd imprisonment there. Now, all of the apostles did missionary travels and started churches, discipling and raising up leaders. We just do not have their stories in the Bible. Together, they wrote 7 epistles, and they were all martyred for their faith. James, the brother of John of the sons of Zebedee, he was martyred first by Herod Archelaus. That's in Matthew 2:19 through 23 and Acts 12:1 through 4. James, the brother of Jesus, called himself a bondservant and wrote the Epistle of James. John did not introduce himself in his epistles. And Jude, another brother of Jesus, called himself a bondservant. So they all walked humbly in understanding that they were serving the Lord, that they were called by God for the work of His kingdom, and they were not doing their will, even as their Lord and Master Jesus did not do His own will, but the will of the Father. So what is the difference between Peter and Paul? Exuberance. Peter was more laid back, taking things as they came. Paul was a go-getter, an A-type personality. Peter was hot-headed before the day of Pentecost. So was Paul before his meeting with Jesus. He held the cloaks of those stoning Stephen, and then he started arresting and persecuting Christians. If you have ever been persecuted by a Christian hater, the one thing they all have in common is being hatefully in your face. Paul and Barnabas broke up their team over John Mark, so his anger didn't go away right away. But Peter and Paul both did what Jesus called them to do, though Peter sometimes needed a little encouragement to get out and keep going. So God bless you as you determine how you are serving God. Are you doing what He called you to do? Are you reading the Bible daily? Remember, they studied the Scriptures daily, and all the Scriptures they had were the Old Testament Scriptures. Acts through Malachi, or Genesis through Malachi. They became the writers of what is the New Testament part of the Bible by living out those experiences. Okay, and that's what God has called us to do, to live out the experience, to be obedient to the will He has called us to do, and to record it, to share it. Our testimony is telling people what God has done in us and through us, for us, and that He has a plan for their life that's better than the life they're living. God bless you as you seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness.